love romance novels, and after a month of non-stop lit fic, I was sort of worn out, and whose entire catalogue was on my TBR than one Miss Beth O'Leary. So I tried out reading all of her books, and I love that for me. I was pulled to them specifically because the premise of the flatshare and the no-show was so strong, but I will say the other two books do have a little bit of a hallmark quality to them. Regardless, I wanted to read all of them because I just like having fun, and I think rom-coms are all about having a good, cute, lovely ass time. So I started with the no-show because I saw a TikTok about it before it had even come out, and it intrigued me. It's about three women who all get stood up by the same man on Valentine's Day, and essentially it's about figuring out why he did that. It has a pretty interesting premise right off the hook, and that had me gripped. Although Joseph, who is the main character, like the main man, is not really very well developed because we see through the women's perspective, we see their lives quite fully, so he is simply described as someone who's handsome and charming. He does show that he is charming at times throughout the book, but not to the extent that the women kind of bake him up to be. They're all really into him, and I get that that's probably why they say that about him, but I don't know if it's there and talk about him like that. Siobhan, who is also one of the trio, is also not very well developed, but this is for plot reasons, which okay, fine, like I understand that, but as a POV character, I do think parts of the story seem like they're jumping from place to place without enough like cohesion. The book perhaps diverged a little bit from what I thought it would be about, and I'm trying to skirt giving spoilers as much as I can, but this book basically doesn't just follow one day where he stands them up like I thought it would initially, and therefore the book itself is quite different. But looking back now, I will say this is probably my favourite of her books so far. Flatshare is her debut novel and also most popular, and has now even been made into a TV show by Paramount+. The book follows two people who are flat sharing a one-bedroom apartment because they work on different schedules. So Leon, who is subletting his flat, works nights and would basically never see Tiffy, who works a normal 9 to 5. And they become friends through leaving notes for each other around their flat, about the flat, and also eventually about their lives, because they never really see each other. The book is fun, but is way less lighthearted than I thought of expected it to be. There are some darker elements that basically make this book way less fluffy near the end than you would expect. Additionally, this book definitely has the most fleshed out characters out of all of the four, so you do get a sense of both of the characters and why you should want them together, instead of just a surface level plot reason, they are the main romantic leads and therefore they should be together. I think that this is because it's her first book and she's had more time to marinate these characters in her head before publishing, whereas I assume the other books were written under sort of a publication time contract crunch, which I assume because they all seem to have a cohesive cover style, so I assume they're all published by the same publisher. So next is the road trip, and this is about exes who are forced to road trip together to a mutual friend's wedding after they get into a car accident at the beginning of their journey and need a lift to get there. The story covers two timelines, one of which is them getting together for the first time up until they break up, and then the current timeline is where they are on their road trip to Scotland. I personally love a second chance lover storyline, so I was pretty excited to read this. However, I do think that this trope doesn't work if the reasoning for why they should get back together isn't strong enough, and I don't really think it's very strong here. Another issue with this book for me is that the male love interest, Dylan, has a much stronger backstory and characterization than his counterpart, Addie. He's a pretty interesting, flawed character. I feel like in romance books especially, male characters are incredibly sort of either forthright, strong and charming, whereas Dylan felt very real and genuine. He's not the leader in his friendship group. His life is not very together, and he cares about everything people think of him, which is exactly what British men are like. A lot of the characters in this book are also very wealthy British top types, and they're all written very well, as a courtesy of Beth O'Leary's time at Oxford University, I presume. Just generally, even though Dylan's not a very good romantic interest, he doesn't have you swooning, he's not enough of a realistic mess to love nonetheless. I still think he's a really fascinating character. I think too often, flawed characters are horribly evil, whereas I think the general lack of sense of self that he possesses as a flaw is very interesting, and therefore that was perhaps my favourite part of this book, was his character. Lastly, we have The Switch. This book is a Hallmark movie mixed with an old people Britcom movie, The novel follows a grandmother and a granddaughter who switch lives by moving to each other's houses. Lena moves from London back to her home in Yorkshire and into her grandmother's house there, and Eileen moves to Lena's trendy Shoreditch flat. They each have their own new projects to complete while they've swapped, lives, and it's all about the things that they can learn as they've upturned their lives to go through a new journey. The book is marked as a romance practically everywhere, but it really isn't. It's a story about a grandmother more than anything else, and there's like no blossoming romance either, so it feels so in tune with those movies about old people rather than anything particularly romantic or emotional. The grandmother gets her own new life in London also, whereas Lena just kind of does exactly what her grandmother would do at home, basically making this plot skew very grandma heavy. And whilst I think Grandma's getting it on is fun and raunchy when it's Maggie Smith or Judi Dench in the character, I don't really care about Eileen. I think those movies carry a level of emotional weight because of the star power, and also maybe because no grandma I know personally would do any of this at 80. Not that you shouldn't have a libido at 80, I just don't think that Eileen is very compelling. Also, I read this book by audiobook, and Lena's chapters are voiced by Daisy Edgar Jones, and I had the shock of the year when I realised she wasn't actually Irish in real life. My overall remarks are that nearly all of the books deal with cheating and assault as themes like throughout. There's this idea in the books that whilst emotional cheating and having a crush on someone whilst you're dating someone is fine, but it's only when you cross the line into physical cheating that it's actually bad. And this seems to be a personal opinion, I think, of Beth Leary's, because it happens a lot. Immoral characters in the books are cheaters, whereas the main characters who want to cheat but are too scared to are actually okay and deserve to be with the person that they initially wanted to cheat it with at the end of the story. Cheating as something bad characters do is also such a cop-out, because I think a lot of the flawed characters who aren't the main characters in her books, like, Dylan, are also very interesting. Like in The Switch, Lena has a boyfriend, however, we get to see these ideas of how he's like bad for her, all of which are like very realistic through the ways, he doesn't let her grieve properly, he acts like he's helpful when his help is very self-serving, he's absent, not very thoughtful, yet the reason he's like enough of a bad character to break up with is not because of any of those things, but because he's a cheater. These blatantly like horrible things about him aren't confronted at all, but instead he's not in the picture anymore because he cheated, and therefore Lena can swiftly get on with the better love interest. The good characterization is wasted here for bad plot, considering how well Ethan is developed as someone who's not evil but not good for Lena. Specifically, it feels empty to not bring that up when it's very well laid out in the book. Marcus, who's a character in the road trip, is similarly very well written. He's selfish, manipulative, self-aggrandizing, but in the book, those traits are brushed over for sort of like a faux happy ending. The need for like a happy romance plot dominates the fact that like Beth Leary is actually really good at writing bad characters. Their realism and their specificity in being terrible people is genuinely so good. Like, these characters are written so intricately to be foils for the specific main characters of those books. I think that's very well, like, written, and it feels like a waste to put them into stories where they aren't the main character. I think I would genuinely much rather read literary fiction about those characters than the rom-coms about the romantic leads that she actually writes about. Aside from cheating, assault and manipulation is a big part of the stories. Because of this, the stories all kind of carry a darker tone nearer the end, and whilst these are things that happen a lot to women, in England 97% of women have been sexually harassed, they kind of sour the tone, and that's fine. Having these themes discussed is still a good thing, since rom-coms don't really always have to be light or airy. But since I read them all one after another, even when it is something that is not generally talked about or depicted in romance novels in a way that isn't, about saving or rescuing a woman for like a damsel in distress moment, it still feels a little overused because it's in a lot of the books. Though I will say credit is where credit's due. I think something that was very interesting is the way that all the characters react differently to their assault, showing in ways in which like people process differently and how there's no good or proper way to do so. Another interesting idea is that there is comfort in seeing a male love interest who is very understanding in the aftermath of assault and how that can change women's perspectives in their newer relationships, especially with Leon in the flatshare. And also, I'm not sure how much I love this theme being in the road trip and the no-show, because whilst we do see the victim's perspective of how it's affected them, how they will continue after it happens, and how they can move on, it still feels a bit too much like something that's kind of thrown in at times and kind of rushed for plot progression at times instead of the character facing it properly. I'm not actually sure that after reading these that this was a good, cute, lovely ass time, like I said. And I'm also not sure whether I was, hardcore rooting for any of these books because I was obsessed with the lead's chemistry either. I felt like I was rooting for them more because the plot demanded it of me. They are pretty easy reads because they are contemporary rom-com-esque, except from The Switch. And honestly, maybe it was the lack of actual romance in the book that, didn't really have me gripped, and I was having more of a struggle actually getting myself to read that one. I am, however, excited for her next book. I will be following whatever she's giving us, though I do hope they're a little bit more cheery, or at least whatever makes the book darker isn't always going to be assault, and that the characters are a bit better fleshed out, because I do think the pacing is very good and the plots of her books are very, like, you know, decently, like, fascinating, at least to keep me interested in wanting to read them. I'd say, you know, with these, read and form your own opinions, and feel free to fight with me and tell me what your opinion on them was. All in all, I've realised that listening to audiobooks and playing Sudoku is great fun, and I will be doing that more often. And also that the audiobooks for these books are actually really good, so if you do want to listen to them, I do recommend.